Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
I think the Iranians and the Axis of Resistance and even Lebanese Hezbollah were victims of their own propaganda. And I think they were victims of their own successes or what they perceived as successes. And because of that, they never gave the other side a true vote. And the Israelis had a vote in this.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Secrets and Spies. In today's special episode, Phillip Smyth returns mere days after his last appearance on the podcast to unpack another seismic event in the Middle East, the assassination of Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah in a targeted Israeli airstrike. Nasrallah's death has sent shockwaves throughout Lebanon, Iran, and the Islamic Republic's web of militia groups, raising urgent questions about the future of Hezbollah and its place in the region's power dynamics. As he's done several times now during this conflict, Phillip will help us understand the players, their backgrounds, and the potential consequences to come. Together, we'll explore Israel's strategic motivations, Iran's response, and what this means for the already tense situation in the Middle East. We'll also look at the broader regional impact, including Israel's ground offensive and Iran's retaliatory ballistic missile attack. It's a complex and fast-moving situation, so stay tuned as we break it down and discuss what might come next. As always, a couple housekeeping notes first. If you enjoy the show, please leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast streaming app of choice. And if you're not already, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's super easy. Just go to patreon.com/secrets and spies. Your generosity helps keep this podcast going. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Phillip Smyth, my friend, what brings you back so soon? Did something happen?
No, nothing really that crazy over the past week. Nothing at all. Or week and a half.
No, nothing at all. Oh, well, I was not planning to do this again so soon in less than a week. As I was editing the last episode that you appeared on, something happened. I'm like sitting at my desk, looking at CNN right there, going, oh, okay. And I hadn't recorded the intro yet, so I had to sort of rework that and note that this happened, but not say the man's state because it was not yet known, and I didn't want to walk out on a limb or anything. But now we have more answers and more of an idea of what's going on and what maybe happen in the future. So yeah, here we are to do a part 2 of the crazy last 2 weeks.
I'm sorry that, given you cover a ton of other additionally, important things, I genuinely actually feel bad coming back and constantly discussing, this issue. Not that I have trouble talking with you, but it's like it never ends. There's always a new update.
This is a corner of the world and a few groups and characters that are have been near and dear to, well, maybe not near and dear to me, but they've been sort of floating in my orbit for many years, as you know.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it. I'll give some background notes on the situation, and then, we'll do our usual thing here. So to start us off, on Friday evening, September 27th, Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, alongside the IRGC Quds Forces commander for Lebanon, and other senior officers were killed in a massive airstrike on a command bunker buried some 60 feet beneath a residential block in South Beirut. The French newspaper Le Parisien reported an Iranian agent informed on Nasrallah's whereabouts. However, according to Ronan Bergman, who, for listeners who are unaware, is the unofficial chronicler of Israeli intelligence. So Ronan Bergman said that Israeli intelligence had tracked Nasrallah's location for months and struck in a limited window before he was to move again. Israeli F-15s dropped over 80 munitions, including U.S.-made 2,000-pound bombs, to fully destroy the complex, which coincided with Bibi Netanyahu's address to the UN General Assembly. Deputy Secretary General Naim Qassem was named as Hezbollah's interim leader. On the 29th, Al Arabiya reported that Hashem Safieddine, head of the group's executive council and Nasrallah's cousin, was appointed his successor. Follow-on air raids by the IDF throughout the weekend targeted Hezbollah command and control nodes and weapons storage facilities, with a continued focus, as before, on the group's long-range missile, rocket, and drone forces. On September 30th, the IDF informed the U.S. of their intent to carry out a limited ground offensive into southern Lebanon designed to clear Hezbollah positions. Beginning with special forces raids, Israeli troops have continued to mass along the border. Clashes with Hezbollah forces inside Lebanon that resulted in Israeli casualties were reported this morning, and I believe had continued a bit throughout the day. Then yesterday, October 1st, in retaliation for the assassinations of Nasrallah and Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in July, Iran fired approximately 180 ballistic missiles at military and government targets throughout Israel, twice the number previously launched in April. Israeli air defenses, with the assistance of U.S. and allied forces in the region, intercepted many, although some caused relatively minor damage on the ground. A few air bases were hit, but are still operational, and judging by videos I saw yesterday, Iran really wanted to hit Mossad's headquarters just north of Tel Aviv. One Palestinian man was killed by a falling missile in Jericho. A few other civilians were wounded in Israel and Jordan. As of this recording, so late afternoon Eastern Time on Wednesday the 2nd, Israeli officials say they'll launch a significant retaliation within days, possibly targeting oil facilities or other high-value sites within Iran. It's worth noting that tomorrow, or the day of this release, is Rosh Hashanah, and next Saturday is Yom Kippur, which may have some bearing on the timing of Israel's response. Philip, are there other Jewish holidays right around now that I'm missing, that I'm forgetting?
Yeah, I mean, there's you got Rosh Hashanah. That's just, I think it's going on right now.
Right? Yeah. It's like, it's past sunset over there. Yeah, so it's technically it's already Rosh Hashanah. But yeah, so that essentially brings us up to speed, Philip. Any major details that I missed before we start talking?
So there are a few key things that are in there. There has been. It's interesting. You mentioned Naim Qassem. So Naim Qassem is the official number 2 within Lebanese Hezbollah.
His book's on my shelf right over there.
Yeah, he wrote that. There were a ton of really fascinating factual errors that are in it, deliberately placed for propagandistic purposes. But again, really interesting book to actually read through for a certain historical take in time for what Lebanese Hezbollah was trying to push out at that time. So it's good that you have it, but keep in mind, when it was written and why it was written for which purposes. But kind of going forward, you mentioned Naim Qassem, and he is an old school Lebanese Hezbollah guy. And even though he's kind of the official number 2, there's a serious doubt in my mind that he would actually ascend to truly being a number 1, because he never really functioned like that. He was markedly more public. He was not as popular, obviously, as Nasrallah. Did not really have the same connections, but was an old hand with the group, but kind of did other stuff. But this kind of brings us to Hashem Safieddine, who was, you mentioned that he's a cousin. I think he's a cousin on it's like Nasrallah's mother's end, because I literally have a chart for this, because Hezbollah, there's been a lot of like kind of intra-family links that go with a lot of kind of the command structure. And he's a really interesting figure that, you're going to hear a lot of the same stuff repeated about him constantly now that he is probably going to be in the catbird seat. So there's only like so much that's known. But interestingly, I would say that since around at least end of 2006 to 2008, it became pretty apparent that he was being kind of groomed to be the successor to Nasrallah. So I want to kind of put that aside. There's another piece to this.
Can we put a pin on that and go back to Nasrallah for a second and then work our way back to him?
Definitely.
Okay, cool. So yeah, let's start with who Hassan Nasrallah was. What impact did he have on Lebanese Hezbollah as an organization and a movement? And what did he represent for Iran's axis of resistance more broadly?
So he was, and it's interesting that you ask this, because I should be having a piece coming out that talks about this a little bit for an Arabic language publication, but I don't want to say it yet, because you need to make sure it gets published. But he had a role that was so multifold and so important within the broader, and I put this in quotes, axis of resistance that Iran had tailored. And we're talking about, with the axis of resistance, it's a collection of Shia militias, Palestinian groups, sometimes secular Marxist organizations. Bashar al-Assad's Syria is roped into that one. Sometimes the Russians are roped in, sometimes the North Koreans are roped in with the axis of resistance. But for all intents and purposes, it's an Iranian-run kind of network of what really amounts to their proxies. And they try to give them kind of certain national, almost a nationalist sounding standing. But if they are ideologically loyal to Iran and following the absolute wilayat al-faqih, it doesn't really, and that's their ideological thinking. That's what it's called in Arabic anyway.
So to put it simply, the axis, all the groups that we've been talking about here together for the last year, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, GC, the Houthis, all the myriad groups in Iraq and stuff, Lebanese Hezbollah, they all together are the axis of resistance, this network of militias that Iran has sort of...
They are all in there. They're all in there, and some are a little bit more equal than others. That's kind of what I was getting at with the ideological bit. And, also, again, a lot of it, the way it's presented, at least kind of its outward face, is, oh, look, there are all these different groups from different nations, and they're coming together, and it's all, kind of hunky-dory, and everyone has an equal seat at the table. No, it doesn't really work that way. The Iranians take charge, and very specific personalities and very specific groups take that kind of leading position within the grouping itself. And this is kind of a replication in some respects of what you've seen in like Iraq with al-Hashd al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, which itself is a collection of 50 militias, mostly Shia militias, mostly Iranian-controlled militias, but there's some kind of, there's a level of diversity there. But a lot of it comes down to who Iran can rope into their side. So where does Nasrallah fit in with this, or where did he fit in with this? Nasrallah, kind of like Qasem Soleimani, or a bit like Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was actually officially the second in command in al-Hashd al-Shabi, but in truth, he was really the leader of it, and really the kind of
Iraqi militia consortium.
Yes. And he was an Iraqi, also married to an Iranian, spoke Persian very well. But he was kind of that main glue that held those Iraqi groups together. Now think of it like Hassan Nasrallah. Hassan Nasrallah didn't just hold together Lebanese Hezbollah and the Lebanese Hezbollah outgrowths in Syria, or groups that were maybe kind of a little bit more prone to being, pro-Hezbollah, let's say in Iraq or elsewhere. He took on an even more unique position than Muhandis. He took on even a more unique position than, say, Soleimani. Because Nasrallah had, we're talking 4 decades of experience and growth within the wider network, within the Iranian proxy groups, and within Lebanese Hezbollah itself. He had a claim to fame. Because of the 2000 pullout of the Israelis from southern Lebanon, 2006, the so-called divine victory against the Israelis. And it's arguable how victorious Hezbollah was, but they survived. And Nasrallah was not killed during that conflict. And it demonstrated that Hezbollah could still fight with a lot of mettle. And so there was kind of this panache that was built up with Nasrallah, just regarding in personality and leadership form and style, that a lot of other militia group leaders, even if they had targeted the Americans, or even if they had tried to target the Israelis, or, done a variety of different moves, they did not have that kind of same credibility that he did. He also was an old school ideologue. The reason I brought up absolute wilayat al-faqih before was because he was an early student of it, but he was far more youthful than any of the now octogenarian leadership that you'd see in Iran or even in Iraq. He was one of those youthful militants, but a cleric, a Sayyid, meaning he's related to the Prophet Muhammad. So you have these different elements that are there that kind of outlined a strong figurehead that was within this grouping, but it went more than that. It wasn't just kind of an outward face. He was heavily invested and heavily involved whenever there was an issue within this network with taking care of it. He was often the interlocutor who the Iranians would go to and say, hey, we've got an issue. We know that, let's say, Muqtada Sadr. Muqtada Sadr is causing us problems, and Muqtada Sadr is the scabrous politico cum cleric from Iraq. People may remember him from the Mahdi army days back in the early days of the Iraq War. But he was for a time, one could call him an Iranian proxy. But I want to say, even during the Iraq War, kind of split away from the Iranians quite a bit. This caused a lot of strife between him and Iran and a lot of the Iranian proxies. but he still had familial links in Lebanon. He'd go to Lebanon. He also had a close connection with Hassan Nasrallah, a personal connection that was built, a bit like Qasem Soleimani or Mohandes, where they would often have this personal connection, that panache that I was talking about, a certain cachet that would go along with their personalities. So a lot of these leaders would kind of go to Nasrallah. Nasrallah being, an Arab, meaning he's Lebanese, he speaks Arabic, he speaks colloquial Lebanese when he is giving a speech. Often he'll do that.
Studied in Tehran as well at the seminaries there, in Qom, not on Tehran.
No, actually, so Nasrallah. Well, are we talking about Sadr, or are we talking about
Nasrallah?
Nasrallah actually, he primarily studied in Najaf. And he was there. He actually studied with Abbas al-Musawi, the person that he replaced after Musawi was killed. But that's actually where he kind of adopted a lot of the Khomeinist thinking, and the reason he brought it back to Lebanon after there were a lot of expulsions of people who tended to like that ideology by this guy that I don't think we remember anymore named Saddam Hussein. But interestingly, Nasrallah was this guy who could be the point man for the Iranians without having, and it's interesting because there's like this dual fold. It's very hard to write about. Nasrallah was identified by plenty of his opposition as being an Iranian lackey. Like, just, he does whatever they tell him. But there was another element that was there too that appeared far more autonomous. It appeared like his own little personality was kind of taking it over. He allowed a certain level of autonomy for Lebanese Hezbollah. Again, they are the crown jewel of the Iranian proxy network. And because of that, again, he carried with him a very, very different style of kind of invigorating different groups and leadership. He was kind of the one that if you had his blessing to have a picture with him taken when he was visiting you, that could really kind of make or break the group. Good example of this is a group. I actually wrote the first profile on them called Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, or Harakat al-Nujaba, which is an Iraqi group, did a lot of recruitment for Syria. But their leader, Akram Kabi, met with him, I want to say from like 2015 on, but the first public one was really 2017. And just because of those meetings, all of a sudden that's the picture that was going out. That's how he got wider credibility. Oh, who's this Iraqi guy? For people in my position, I knew who he was going well back to the Iraq War. And kind of the targeting that he would do of American forces and the recruitment he was doing for Syria. But for people who are not as invested in looking at this kind of microcosm of Middle Eastern politics, that's like the thing that put him, like really, put him out there. So, I mean, he carried that with him. That legitimacy going on even with ideology, and I talk about this in part in that article, there's a lot of credibility that's being lost for Iran's transnational ideology of absolute wilayat al-faqih. There's corruption in their country. There's a lot of other issues. There's repression. A lot of people think it's, a bunch of octogenarians who are just pushing around, people who just don't really want this system or setup anymore. And Nasrallah brought a very different character to it that even I think his opposition would agree that it kind of felt a little bit more Lebanese, felt a little bit more Arab. Oh, if the Arabs have an issue in the Iranian thinking, have them go to Nasrallah. Or maybe they would just go to Nasrallah on their own, because that was the interlocutor to get to the Iranians and maybe negotiate a deal in the middle. I mean, that's what happened with Muqtada Sadr quite a bit. So, I mean, you have to think about Nasrallah in this position where he was this key linchpin, a guy who was marketed as having absolute and total success against the hated Israelis and the hated Americans, somebody who demonstrated complete loyalty to the absolute wilayat al-faqih, albeit I will say more privately. He changed public statements where he didn't really back away from wilayat al-faqih, but he didn't emphasize it quite so much. Like in 2009, Hezbollah did that, but it was still there, still kicking. That's like the primary system they use. But he had a very, very interesting place, and it's pretty much irreplaceable for the Iranians, just like Soleimani is technically irreplaceable, or Mohandes is technically irreplaceable. This is the other person who I would say within that pantheon, those three guys were like this triumvirate of very powerful, interesting people who really kept the ball rolling. And it's interesting, like, what's the closest comparison one could have now? Maybe Abdul Malik al-Houthi, but the Houthis have their own issues, and they're also in Yemen, and it's like a whole bit of separation that's there, even right down to the Shiism exhibited. So, I mean, it's, very different kind of guy.
I just want to jog listeners' memories real quick. Qasem Soleimani was an Iranian general, longtime commander of the Quds Force. Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, as you've said, was sort of Soleimani's deputy for all the Iraqi militia groups. They were both killed in a U.S. drone strike outside Baghdad airport at the very beginning of 2020. Did you expect that Israel would eliminate Nasrallah, to do so now and in this way?
So I would say 80% yes, but there's a 20% no on that too.
Mm-hmm.
When we spoke about the pager attacks, I mean, I'm trying to put this into kind of a grander formula for what the Israelis would want, try to spell it out for people listening. When Fuad Shakur, to remind everyone, was a senior leader within Lebanese Hezbollah, very secretive. He was on the Jihad Council, really important old school guy, another one of the irreplaceable type of people that have been there from the start, a guy who assisted with bombing a number of American facilities in Lebanon, including the U.S. Embassy. When that happened, that was a direct shot across Nasrallah's bow. Because, I mean, whatever the details were, and of course you're going to have a million journalists that are going to say X, Y, and Z, and God only knows how much of this is deliberately peppered out there to have a certain, add-on effect for those reading it. So I tend to kind of give it less credibility until I kind of get more collected and there's more time, which isn't always helpful when, you got to do this for a living and follow a lot of it.
Yeah, it's a moving target.
Yeah, constantly. But I would say after that moment, after his killing by the Israelis, and they killed him in an apartment complex, I think this actually plays even higher than when Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Iran. That's the former head of Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that killing, somebody at the literal core of Lebanese Hezbollah who had personal phone calls with Nasrallah on a regular basis, personal meetings with him, who was a true leader within the group that was completely opaque. The only reason many people even knew about him was because of the rewards for justice post that had gone up. And this is they had put this up a couple of years ago. But nobody really kind of beyond that, nobody was writing profiles on the guy like they even were Nasrallah. But he was a core element that was there. And then there was this rumor that came out that he may have actually been on the phone with Nasrallah. And if you were able to get to Shakur, then clearly you'd be able to get to Nasrallah. And I looked at that, and this part of me was going, okay, part of this is the Israelis calling the Iranian bluff of, hey, we're going to posture. The Iranians saying we're going to posture and we're going to give you this, these terrible reactions. We're going to blow stuff up. You guys are going to have a terrible time. And I think the Israelis looked at this and said, yeah, there's a lot more bark than there is bite. And beyond that, it's a golden opportunity now after the failures in 2006, after this kind of interwar war that was going on where you had logistical networks and specialized weapon systems being targeted by the Israeli Air Force and by their intelligence services, that, let's call it, number one. Number two, let's hit very, very hard because there is a certain... there's a political reality now going on where you have the American administration, America being the strongest ally to the state of Israel, where they're kind of on their way out. And also they've demonstrated a lot of, I think you could pretty much objectively make this call, and I realize more partisan people would probably disagree with me. And again, I'm trying to say this is not a partisan call from how it looks. This is dispassionate.
Okay.
There have been a lot of weak decisions coming from Washington and a lot of dancing around certain issues. Even the way that figures with groups that were targeting the U.S. and Israel, but primarily targeting the Americans, the way the Americans would actually hit back was in a way that was to not really call the Iranians out. Hey, let's not escalate this. That was the key term. You keep hearing that now. Well, there's escalation. And I think, again, the Israelis looked at this and said, okay, well, where's the escalation? Okay, let's try this. And they kept seeing nothing was going to happen. So that was part one to this. Part two, with the beeper attacks, and it's been coming out in my head a little bit more clearly, and it's fascinating. I was actually on Twitter X, the spaces that they have. Actually,
I saw you on there a couple minutes ago. I almost jumped on, but I was busy.
You should have. That would have been interesting. I got to tell one of the people on there that I had a specific propaganda poster from Lebanon on the wall because it was supporting my point, which is how esoteric can we get? But anyway, I was just on there, and the host of it actually had a wonderful point that was clicking around in my head, but he summarized it a hell of a lot better than I could have done it. And it was quite clear what the Israelis were doing with the pager attacks. Yes, there was the added on psychological benefit where you're saying to Hezbollah, your internal comms that you fought for in 2008, because just to remind people, Lebanese Hezbollah invaded Beirut and then also crushed a lot of opposition to protect their internal communications, fiber optic network.
You went into a lot of detail about that on the last one you were on.
Yeah.
Last weekend. Yeah.
Well, the beepers were connected in with that, and that was a highly guarded and secretive thing that Hezbollah did. It was a really important piece of the puzzle for the group. And then here the Israelis come in and nail all the beepers on there. But it's not just that. It's not just the psychological reaction. You've now removed people who are of lower, intermediate, and senior levels. Now, the guys who are a little bit more low level and intermediate, clearly these are trusted people. They're getting things like the radio systems that Hezbollah used, because they also targeted these radios, these ICOM radios, and then also the beepers. If you have a beeper, then hey, you're connected in. It's like being a doctor at a hospital. Yeah, I got the special beeper. But now what you've done is you've removed their arms. In some cases, you may have decapitated them. You may have removed a chunk of their leg. It's really hard to pull the trigger on an ATGM, an anti-tank guided missile, or wire-guided missile. It's really hard to do that when you have all your fingers blown off because you're picking up the pager. So there was a tactical benefit to doing this because you're getting the guys who would be kind of leading those units. And I think I mentioned this in the last one. It may look like a low-level guy got hit, but that was, for the 5 guys in his village of like 500 in the Baqa, it's still technically a command position. You lose a guy like that, it's not good.
He was their point of entry to the rest of the organization.
Correct. And also kind of their de facto commander in some respects.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have it, you see this run up, and it's the run up to, okay, how do you disable senior levels of leadership? That's 1. 2, how do you hurt people who are most likely going to hurt you if you try rolling into the country or you try disabling an organization militarily? Then there's this kind of third point going in. It's and how do you cause pain within the organization that reverberates for a long time to come if you can't completely destroy the group? And I think the Israelis are not in the mindset that they believe they can just kind of roll into Lebanon and magically no Hezbollah will be there, because they've wiped it out. I think we can already see that by today. And I think one of the things I said to you, and I know I said this to another journalist, look for early casualty results from the Israelis, and you'll see how well, Hezbollah at least is trying to stack the card and stack the deck so that they can get some hits in. Well, what happened today? I think it was 7 or 8 Israelis that were killed fighting in southern Lebanon. And again, I'm not saying that couldn't be for a variety of other reasons, but my point is, it doesn't mean that Hezbollah is out of the game, and it doesn't mean that they're just kind of completely going to vanish because Nasrallah happened to be killed. But I do think that there was this run-up that really all of these pieces were fitting together, and it's just a massive decapitation strike. And with that decapitation strike, I mean, I was trying to mention Naim Qassem before and talk about him. There was somebody else who I would have actually put into kind of the networking with Naim Qassem, who a lot of people I think have forgotten, and he was also killed literally a couple hours after Nasrallah, and it maybe got an AFP article, maybe got like a Reuters article, I don't know, like a 400-word piece, and that was of Nabil Kaouk. Nabil Kaouk is somebody that I had written quite a bit about really early in my career, I guess kind of the official career when I was in an academic institution.
Think Tankistan?
Yeah, I think Tankistan. But this is a guy who was kind of the always the number 3 in Hezbollah, and like a really prominent and important one. He was actually the one who was at the Iranian president's funeral. That's the one who they had, standing in the front row as a representative from Lebanese Hezbollah. Old hand in the organization, really important in terms of managing things in the south. He was on their central committee, their executive committee. Like he was always there. Like he kept popping up. So, I mean, and it's interesting. They got him. They got a number of other commanders. I can't even name them anymore because so many were happening in such rapid succession that if I opened my Excel sheet with kind of leadership charts and everything else, I still haven't been able to cross off or put them in red all the names that have been essentially eliminated from that list. Yeah, even with the Israelis producing stuff, because clearly other people were killed as well, and I don't think a lot of that stuff has even become more public. I mean, this even goes for kind of rank and file fighters or people who are manning, rockets, different rocket setups. So you had this like really far, very, very deep kind of 3 to 5 levels of Lebanese Hezbollah that had been really successfully targeted by the Israelis. And I think the Israelis were banking on the shock and awe that they kind of created with this, and the other issues coming forward where, okay, well, who replaces him? Oh, God, that guy's now dead. Oh, who do they replace? Oh, well, I don't know where he is. And he's dead. Oh, no, he's missing a finger because of the beeper. I think part of this was a markedly deeper calculation for really pushing the group back and establishing, at least in southern Lebanon, some level of, and I put this in quotes, some level of security that the Israelis could tolerate for, I don't know, some specific period of, or maybe it's actually a more vague period of time in their heads.
Is Hashem Safadine confirmed as Nasrallah's successor? Is it like a done deal? Is that set?
So technically they have to vote on it. So Naim Qasim, when he gave his speech, and he gave this on the 30th, it was interesting. He actually tried to imitate a lot of Nasrallah isms, but they all kind of came off as not as good. I mean, not that anybody would be tricked to think that Naim Qasim could really pull off a good Nasrallahism. But, his sweating and kind of wiping of the brow, Nasrallah used to do that quite a bit, and it was kind of this endearing quality when he would speak. At least it was with people who supported him. And Naim Qasim, meanwhile, as he was kind of patting his brow, this got mocked roundly in a lot of kind of private Arabic language circles. I know the Israelis kind of marched with it and said, yeah, he looked far more nervous than he did confident. But even the way the speech was delivered was kind of, you could tell a lot was off. You could just tell. It was palpable. But yeah, anyway, he was saying that, the different committees within Lebanese Hezbollah are going to eventually elect a new leader. Now, there's always the possibility that somebody comes in there and is picked. But from the looks of it, and this is going back to Hashem Safi al-Din, he's a person with a lot of very deep connections to the Nasrallah network. So one, you have familial connections. Two, he's also connected to the IRGC very closely. And when I say that, he's actually married to Zainab Soleimani. That is Qasim Soleimani's daughter. And she's also the person who runs the foundation for Qasim Soleimani, the Martyrdom Foundation. And she also spoke in Beirut after he was killed. She made sure to speak there, where her husband's located. So it's very interesting. I mean, you see kind of how this is all kind of getting grouped together. And with Safi al-Din, for quite a while, he was being set up to be in the leadership kind of functions for Hezbollah. And there's a few reasons why he would have been an interesting pick. So one, he kind of looks like Hassan Nasrallah. He does. He trims his beard in a similar way. He kind of looks like him, kind of where the graying is in his hair. It's like a fascinating kind of study in how you do kind of imagery for the baseline in PR. Okay, well, he kind of looks like the last guy, so I guess that might be the same thing. Oddly, that actually works quite a bit with a lot of different kind of PR approaches. And interestingly enough, I mean, if you ever watch a speech that he does, he tries to imitate the cadence and the speech style of Hassan Nasrallah. Obviously, he doesn't have the lisp, and he doesn't have kind of the same level of confidence with backing that goes into it that Nasrallah really did. But it's interesting how a lot of that's being aped. Anyway, kind of going off of that, he also has a very deep connection with the Iranians, and this goes further than just Soleimani's daughter being married to her. He would technically be the first head of Lebanese Hezbollah, the first Secretary General, who was not religiously educated in Iraq. He was instead religiously educated in Qom. And I think you may have been confusing Nasrallah with him on this. But he actually went to the institutes that are run directly by Khamenei to kind of do his religious studies, which means it's a full dose of absolute wilayat al-faqih. It's like an absolute full dose of the state ideology along with the theocratic ideology that's kind of melded into one. And so that's kind of his background on it. He is clearly representative of a newer, different second generation of both Lebanese Hezbollah, but also within as a larger collective, the Islamic revolutionaries, who's taking over for the guys who are we're not really 1979 veterans, meaning veterans of the Islamic Revolution in Iran and kind of its outgrowths that occurred in Iraq and Lebanon and elsewhere. He is now that second generation where there were established kind of foundational institutions that are with a lot of the different groups that surround what the Iranians have been trying to push and within Iran itself.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with more. should we look at Safadin's term like some fresh-faced private showing up in the trenches at the Somme? Like, there's no need to learn his name or get attached because he'll probably be dead in a week, or could he have some shelf life here?
Well, I think the way the Israelis are eliminating leadership in Hezbollah, your comparison to a Brit or a French soldier showing up in the Somme might not be so incorrect. However, I would say studying him is going to be very important. Thus far, he's not dead. It's already been on the books that he's likely going to be the successor. Whoever the successor might be, he's still a major player within Lebanese Hezbollah, and he was set up to be one. And this is, again, it goes back to early 2000s, even late 90s. I've seen some writings in Arabic and in English arguing that it was as far back as like 97, 98, 99, that kind of period. So, I would say it's very, very important to understand him because of where the organization of Lebanese Hezbollah, and again, as a whole, a lot of the axis of resistance groups that will send people, their clerical leadership, and they all have, well, most of them have some level of Shia clerical leadership if they're a Shia militia modeled off of Lebanese Hezbollah. They have sent people like that to Qom. This is kind of what you're getting. And in Iraq, they're also, they're in different stages too on this. So I mentioned before Akram Kabi, and he's a sheikh, but he actually studied under the Sadrist school. He was Muqtada Sadr's aide for a little bit. He studied under Muhammad Sadr.
I was just going to ask you that, yeah.
But very different guy who's completely adopted Khomeinism. Now, we can argue as to why he's adopted it and why he's trying to be so loyal and why he, puts out for the Iranians whenever they ask. But I think that's immaterial. Still a young guy, but in a way, it almost it's an odd parallel, but then markedly different still from even Nasrallah in terms of how one gets into this mix. And I wrote about this before. I think with Nasrallah's with his loss, you are seeing kind of this other loss of that kind of original gusto, that fervor that came with, supporters of the Islamic Revolution. He organically adopted this line of thinking when he was in Najaf. He was associated with people who eventually became leadership within Lebanese Hezbollah, Abbas al-Musawi. So when you see something like that, that is an organic growth and an organic development of ideological thinking. Whereas now the Iranians are almost kind of reverting back to, like when I was writing this for CTC Sentinel, I didn't really talk about, for West Point's CTC Sentinel, I didn't really discuss the ideological chunks of this, but there is this kind of sticks and carrots approach that the Iranians will take to proxy groups. Now, initially, earlier on, you had groups that were approaching Khomeini and his camp and saying, we want to start a Khomeini-type group in our country and extend the Islamic Revolution. We would love to do that. We are true believers. Okay, that's all well and good. But now you have groups that are kind of brought over to the side using money, using other forms of influence, using sometimes if they don't listen, sometimes using physical force to get them on side. Sometimes the Iranians will splinter the group. Well, the same thing goes for religious thinking as well. Now they're kind of coming along and saying, yeah, I guess I'll take that course in Qom. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, we believe in absolute wilayat al-faqih. And then they have a disagreement with the Iranians, and all of a sudden that little statement on their webpage disappears. I've actually seen this happen in real time. And you can read the tea leaves only so much. It's like Kremlinology, except, with a little bit more added to it. But I would say it's a very different approach going forward now. It's because it's become so institutionalized, and with that, you can kind of see it more pink and naked and see corruption that occurs when you're running a state. You can see other bits that don't really apply to running, essentially God's state on earth, and Khamenei is technically Imam al-Mahdi's representative on earth, according to how the system works. I think a lot of people who are not as well-versed with Shia theological thinking, they're probably looking at this, especially like your average American listening to this going like, what? They think he's the agent of God on earth. That sounds like a pope, except a pope who wants to achieve nuclear weapons, in some ways. So, you have something like that. And it's interesting. It's a distinct change from what happened when Khomeini was around and a lot of these original old school guys who were true believers are around. Doesn't mean the new school aren't true believers in and of themselves, but they're from a very different setup and from a very different time. And I don't really think it's not quite the same, and doesn't carry with it a lot of the push that really, Nasrallah was bringing to the table.
Hezbollah's previous Secretary General, Abbas al-Musawi, who you mentioned a bit earlier, was assassinated in February 1992, which shows how long Nasrallah was in the job, 32 years, when Israeli Apache helicopters fired on his motorcade in southern Lebanon. Can Musawi's death tell us anything about how the group adapts going forward into, I don't know what you want to call it, Hezbollah 3.0?
I mean, a few things. I mean, I think it can also tell us about what, you can tell a lot about what responses are possible for Lebanese Hezbollah for this. I mean, again, we looked at the missile strike that happened. There's a high likelihood, and I've seen different estimates all around. There are around 200 to 250 missiles that may have been launched. Some were saying upwards of 400 may have been launched, and then 180 to 181.
Yesterday?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
the Pentagon was only saying 180.
They're saying 180 because that's what's actually kind of penetrated into Israeli airspace. And
Oh, okay.
a lot of like what was successful, what actually kept flying, what didn't just, fall out of the sky or,
right.
Get hit by some weapon system that we don't know that we paid for yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a space
behind the green door, behind the green door.
But I mean,
where it stays.
You look at that, and Iran had to lead the charge on that. Iran had to launch these medium-range ballistic missiles with their solid fuel and everything else. Well, when Musawi was killed, there were a number of massive car bombings. What really put Hezbollah on the map again after a ton of massive truck and car bombings in Beirut, targeting American forces, the French, actually targeting pretty much anyone who was on their list they didn't like. But I mean, look at Argentina. They targeted the Israeli embassy there, and that was a very successful attack. And then the EMEA building, the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentina's history. And the EMEA building was not a governmental building; it was a Jewish institution, pro-Israel, obviously, but it was a civilian target. They also tried to target, the Israeli embassy in London. This was kind of roped in with potential responses that were for Musawi's death. You had other little rocket attacks here and there. I mean, you name it. But now, I mean, I think because there's been such an intelligence roll-up of Lebanese Hezbollah overseas, I'm not saying it's been so completely successful that they have no capability of doing so, but that was so threatening and such a nasty shock when these attacks did occur. That I think a lot of work in Western intelligence agencies was done to kind of blunt that force. And if you remember, even recently, when Lebanese Hezbollah has tried to do different attacks, they tried in Thailand, they tried in India, they tried to put little limpet mines on Israeli diplomats' cars at some points. I mean, the Burgas bombing
Bulgaria too, yep.
That was in India. Burgas bombing in Bulgaria. The interesting thing about that one was, and it's interesting, like Lebanese Hezbollah always kind of has its hands in this. Ever since 2005, they've been doing it more and more, where there are these like fake Sunni cutout groups that they'll have. And so the guy who bombed the bus, wanted to be a Sunni jihadist, but clearly had a lot of links to Lebanese Hezbollah, but boarded this bus, being a Sunni jihadist and did the job. And it was kind of the Iranians kind of thumbing their nose at two different foes at the same time. Same thing goes with Rafiq Hariri. One of the claims was that, some Palestinian guy, and he was standing in front of, a black flag, that he was killing him as a response to what was going on. He thought he was killing the Iraqi prime minister. And this was back in 2005.
Rafiq Hariri was a Lebanese prime minister assassinated in a big car bomb linked through a long UN investigation to Hezbollah and the Syrians in 2005.
Yes. Nailed it.
Yeah.
But that actually what sparked off the Cedar Revolution in 2005, his killing.
Mm-hmm.
But that was essentially, there was this claim that was out there. Actually, if you read Nicholas Blandford's book on this, he doesn't really detail it in the way that I'm describing it, because at the time he wrote it, that for a lot of journalists, that was a possibility that could have happened, although it, didn't really sound as kosher, pun intended, when you kind of are looking through it and kind of seeing certain trend lines. But it's interesting. I mean, they have had to use different levels of subterfuge, and also have had just a lot of kind of half-assed and failed attacks that have occurred more recently. And I think it shows a degradation of capability, over time. So, now you need to look at, well, what can Lebanese Hezbollah bring to the table? And I mean, obviously it's going to be far more regionally focused, but it's markedly different than, I'm not saying it's not possible for them to try a truck bomb somewhere. And I'm not saying that they couldn't pull one over if they really, really put their thinking caps on. But I mean, you can definitely see that there's a distinct change. And this is, again, I mean, comparing this to Moussawi and what happened with him, going into Hezbollah 3.0 to answer that, I think we're going to see this ascension of a lot of these Hezbollah 2.0 type people into the 3.0 that are used to working as functionaries within an Iranian controlled system. Again, time will tell. I mean, you don't know what can happen. I mean, with Nasrallah, he was known for being a fiery speaker, and he was known for, sometimes being out with, some of the guys who were in infantry units. But what really got him a lot more credibility was part one of this, the fact that his son Hadi was killed by the Israelis in 1997 because he was fighting as a Hezbollah fighter. So that was kind of an interesting thing that kind of set him aside, that said he was a true believer. The other thing that set him aside, which might not always be read as a positive, was when Hezbollah had its own little shakeup, and this was around 1992, and it was from 1992 until around 1998, when there were splits within the group. One of them was actually led by Sheikh Tufaili, who you might see on Twitter quite a bit, who will be saying anti-Iranian things and anti-Lebanese Hezbollah things. But Tufaili was technically the first head of Lebanese Hezbollah. He was actually the emissary who went to Iran and asked, hey, can we start this group in Lebanon that follows these Khomeinist precepts? But he revolted against this, and in some parts because he was from the Baqa, whereas Nasrallah and a lot of the new leadership was coming from the south, the Janub. And so there was kind of this geographic split, and there's a lot of other stuff that was going on. But Nasrallah was able to still solidify things under his leadership. That was another kind of big play. But a lot of this took 40 years to build with Nasrallah. 40 years for him to build up the both capacity and also kind of the view that he could lead the organization successfully, have successes with them, and then successfully market them. And I think a large part of this is kind of marketing, because, one could make the argument that in 2006, given, a good chunk of Lebanon was absolutely flattened, Lebanese Hezbollah lost a lot of guys. But yeah, did the Israelis not perform quite so well? They did not. But if it were not for certain kind of the stars aligning, then Nasrallah might not have been able to kind of pull this off in the way that he did. There were certain historical conditions that were there. So in terms of kind of the Lebanese Hezbollah 3.0, you have a lot of, opportunities that need to kind of arise where you have leadership there that can kind of attain both the skills and then also kind of the awareness from the population that they are, actual combat leaders. They are actual people who can get stuff done. They have a unique panache that kind of can focus on kind of internal communal issues, which Nasrallah demonstrated quite a bit. Actually, he was the model for the Iranians kind of allowing certain kind of nationalistic sounding tones with a lot of their proxy groups, even though they are fundamentally against a lot of that stuff, ideologically speaking. But I would wait for that. Then there's another piece to this. Who's rising up within the group? Not just people who graduated from Qom, from a seminary in Qom run by the Islamic Revolution. No, it's also other people who were recruits that were fielded from tail end of 2006 war until going around the Syria war. So we're talking about a lot of people who were newer assets that were there, and a lot of those newer assets, again, kind of like Safi al-Din, these are people who have gone through the Lebanese Hezbollah institution. They understand how certain elements of wasta, clout and connections, would work with that. Oh, well, my dad's a commander, and I guess that means I get to be a commander too. Fascinating how many commanders had sons who were commanders. Like, for instance, Mohammed Arad, who's the head of the political committee within Lebanese Hezbollah, he lost his son, I want to say, in November of 2023. He, interestingly enough, was a commander. We had Imad Mughniya, who was a leading Hezbollah commander right from the start. His son, Jihad Mughniya, who had a number of songs written about him by Lebanese Hezbollah musical performers. He was an al-Qaid. He was a Shahid al-Qaid. So he was a martyr commander. Young guy, but still a martyr commander. And there are a lot of these family networks that are kind of now just they're kind of grandfathered into the network and the system. With that comes, not just the familial connections, but also the connections with cash, the political connections, and certain realities that are there that, again, have caused issues for this ideological thinking in Iran. The other thing is also kind of the tactical know-how on the ground. Depends on what the Israelis are going to do in Lebanon. I think it remains to be seen. I still think that their version of the quote-unquote limited incursion will be probably south of the Litani. There might be some penetrations elsewhere. It might even be even more limited to just kind of targeting tunnels and, this, that, and the other thing in the south. But still, what do they learn from that experience? How many of the guys who were stationed down there who may actually have more veteran experience, how are they going to come up in the group? Where is their experience going to go? Because clearly the old school guys who were there, a lot of them have been wiped out. That's a lot of historical memory to wipe out within an organization. That is a lot of stuff where, now it kind of fades into just being, a propaganda statement and a poster. So, what are they getting out of these guys? And just to remind everyone, Lebanese Hezbollah itself, and I always hate this because there was a whole period in the 90s and 2000s when if you were a master's student on Middle East studies, then you would have written about Hezbollah's transformation. And that was always, well, they have social networks and they entered Lebanese parliament, thus they've moderated and they're totally a cool group. I'm not talking about that with this. But there's a military transformation that was going on, and a number of people studying the issue really, called it out, where Lebanese Hezbollah was trying to transform into more of an army apparatus, where they had more conventional style arms, where they were respected as an armed force, not just kind of the state within a state and, we have an insurgent army and yeah, we might be able to hold off the Merkavas, but, really if the Israelis wanted to give the rah-rah push, they're going to be in Beirut in a week. I think there was a big shift that happened there. And when that happened, the organization and its military leadership and structure changed quite significantly in terms of who they were letting in as recruits, in terms of the training regimens, a lot of other organizational regimens. There was another piece to that as well. It's also, you might see this a lot, the talking about the unity of the fronts. There's always a big comment on that now. The unity of the fronts, which is kind of hilarious to me because throughout the Syrian war, it was about the unity of the fronts all the time, but no one was paying attention because it wasn't as interesting as this one, I guess. I'm sorry, I'm sounding so mocking about that, but it infuriates me. But it's one of those things where now you have Lebanese Hezbollah intermediate level commanders who are used to operating with, let's say, Iraqi groups or local Syrian groups or the Syrian Arab Army, and they will have their opinions on these groups. They will have their opinions on their capabilities and how well they fight and what that means for a larger axis of resistance, what that means for Lebanese Hezbollah's place at the table when it comes to dealing with them. And I think that will be another add-on effect. Do I know what that'll really result in? I frankly couldn't even tell you. I wish I could. But I do think it will have some form of an effect, both negative and positive.
So in roughly 2 weeks, Hezbollah's internal communication networks were compromised, crippling thousands of their senior and mid-ranking members. This is to say nothing of Mossad's work on the Ismail Haniyeh hit in Tehran earlier in the summer. The IDF then decapitated their command and control, and now, according to Israeli and U.S. officials in the New York Times, half of the missile and rocket arsenal they accumulated over the last 30 to 40 years has been destroyed. This is all largely due to Iranian security services being turned into Swiss cheese by Mossad. How do the Iranians, from their standpoint, I'll just say it, unfuck this? Time heals all wounds, of course, but how do they even begin?
That's $64,000 question for the Iranians. Not to give policy advice for that side.
It's sort of a crisis of their own incompetence that made this.
Yes. Well, I think part of the problem here that needs more assessment, and I really wish I could write the piece on it, and I think about it sometimes, but I know that I wouldn't really be able to do it true justice.
I believe in you. You can do it.
Too kind. I just keep doing these podcasts and they keep taking time away from me writing. No, I'm just kidding. But
maybe I'll give you the transcripts and you can just kind of reshape them into your paper.
Well, I'll put it this way. I think the Iranians and the axis of resistance and even Lebanese Hezbollah were victims of their own propaganda. And I think they were victims of their own successes or what they perceived as successes. And because of that, they never gave the other side a true vote. And the Israelis had a vote in this. And no one really gave it to them. And, after messing things up in 2006, how much senior leadership for Hezbollah were the Israelis really able to get during that conflict? Compared to now, it's like zero, zero compared to 1,000. I mean, to think that your foe was not going to develop different setups when they realized that you could very well be bringing an existential threat, right to their door, I think was a big misstep by them. I also think, in part, their view of American. I think we could, I don't think it would be unfair to say American weakness in their face on a lot of issues. I think, again, there were problems going forth with pretty much every single American administration dealing with Iran for one reason or another. The way that we've generally countered the Iranians was kind of standoffish. It's, well, we've got to deal with this, and okay, we'll handle this later, or hey, let's just cut this deal and it'll go away. And also a lot of that came down to, our analysis of their actions and capabilities sometimes would have been overstated. And I think, American analysts often do that anyway. We often view things through our own lens. And, God, I mean, if they're saying they have a nuclear missile, they must have a nuclear missile, when that might not even be the case. Probably it's just, tinfoil with some paint on it. And again, I'm not saying that's the case with the Iranians. I'm just saying in general, there is often an overstatement that's there. And it comes from the best possible place, but it results in very bad policy. And I think with the Iranians, a lot of this was coming down to, hey, we can shut down international shipping. Hey, we can cause this problem. Hey, we can cause this problem. You want us to bomb your embassy? You want us to take over your embassy? If you recall what happened for why Qasem Soleimani and Mohandes were killed in 2020, it was because they were threatening the American embassy and came very close to getting in there. How, whatever their true willpower behind that was, I mean, it remains to be seen, but clearly they saw an opportunity there, but a lot of aggressive posturing when you're able to get away with it. And again, I leave out the Soleimani and the Mohandes hit, but I say with a lot of other things, if the American response to this has been, hey, we're going to hit an empty depot in eastern Syria on the Iraqi border, and maybe we kill some low-level, Shia militia guy who can't find America on the map, and isn't really a piece of the command apparatus, okay, that sends a message. If the Americans are unwilling to kill, Iranian command and leadership, which is essentially leading these organizations, with the exception of Soleimani, there hasn't really been a lot of follow-up from that, then you have an issue there. I mean, I think when you have domestic politics playing a game, when it comes to, let's say, Iran deal and like a lot of other stuff, that adds more complications to this. And I think the Iranians looked at this as, hey, we not only have kind of a quasi get out of jail free card, if shit really hits the fan, but we can keep pushing. And yeah, we might take some hits, but they're not going to be that big. We can keep pushing and we can bite off. When we bite something off, it's not going to be more than we can chew. And look what we pulled off in Syria. Look what we pulled off here. Look what we pulled off there. Yeah, it cost a lot, but it was worth it.
Bashar's ass.
Yes. So I think the cumulative result of that, they now have Iraq. They now have Syria. They now technically have Yemen. They have threatened and caused issues in Bahrain and Eastern Saudi, two countries where one of them you have the American Fifth Fleet, Bahrain. In Saudi, you have a kind of key American ally and huge oil producer. I mean, it's like you look at little instances like that. Then you look at other little elements where a lot of these groups have been able to metastasize and essentially dominate government. Lebanon, you have Hezbollah. And one of the issues with Hezbollah is, a lot of American policymakers, and we've talked about this, there is this, I think this degradation in terms of like, how do you handle the Middle East? And I think it's been phrased as, well, I'm just being realistic, or we're just, using realism here. Well, Hezbollah's the main actor on the ground. The Iranians are the main actors. And so you got to deal with them, shrug your shoulders and just say, so be it. Where's how are you going to cooperate with any of the other groups? Well, who cares? We're kind of at this point now. But you were talking about before the last podcast that we did about fatigue from the Iraq War, where we got to see firsthand a lot of the interesting complexities that would occur with how you deal with certain networks in Iraq, or tribal groupings, like all sorts of complications. Where
in many ways, SOCOM wrote the book on how to deal with this stuff in Iraq at that time.
Yes. But I mean, again, there's fatigue that comes from that. And there's fatigue when, part of the line is, well, hey, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan. I've had enough of this.
Mhm.
We're done with that. I mean, and I see that there's a general attitude that's there, and it does spill over. And again, I don't want to place this all on the shoulders of American policymakers for missteps or even correct steps and other things that have led to it. But again, there is a general line of thought that can come from that. And again, I don't want to make this too America-centric. So again, you make policy missteps based on those issues if you're the Iranians. Now, again, you're saying how do they unscrew this one? It's going to take a lot, and given what has been thrown out there, I think quite deliberately so by people in in Israeli intelligence, part of it was, well, did they infiltrate something within the IRGC? Did they turn certain members? Well, we've seen before that certain members could be turned. There is some
Yeah.
dissension in the ranks there. It may be a very ideological group and very, very roped in, but all you need is, one or two or three bad apples.
There had to have been serious human sources recruited, or like these guys are just walking around live streaming their lives 24/7. It's like
That's also
one
a
or the other.
possibility. Let me just say
Yeah.
this. There's a lot of stupid stuff that happens that doesn't require a high level of kind of intelligence
That's true.
background to know that, oh, is that supposed to be on here? I can tell you this firsthand from research that I've done in terms of me, dork, who's sitting on my now ex-girlfriend's couch, who, it's just like, this is what I'm obsessed with. So it's not like I come back from work and I keep doing this stuff. And I'm finding in just like personal Facebook posts of, it looks like this guy's in Syria. It looks like, this other guy got killed. They haven't announced it yet, but I'll just put that over here. And it looks like this group is there now, but they haven't officially announced it. In fact, they're saying the opposite. This stuff was all out there to be grabbed and looked at. So I can say sometimes there is stuff that's just put out because there's no real thought put into it. And it's kind of hard when you're the Iranians, and a lot of it comes down to your PR and the messaging that you're sending outwardly. And they're very big on messaging. They're very, very big on the money that's spent when it comes to that. Why is it almost every militia needs to have a TV network and 37 social media pages? Why do they need a Telegram page that clearly has like 5 people running the damn thing? Like it's
clout.
But you look at this, it's not just clout, but it's the constant need to have this Gatling gun of content flashing in your face. It's also quite clear they work with other international partners too, who also see a benefit in that. And when I say international partners, I'm assuming it's the Russians, which is a lot of kind of weird overlap with that. But I think, you kind of boil this down, and it's kind of, where are the priorities? How are you doing I've noticed that they did close down quite a bit that they were posting. There was a big security push that happened during the Iraq part of their campaign, meaning 2014 to 2018, a bigger professionalization. So there is some learning that's there, but again, how deep is that learning? And I don't know if it's that deep. I think there was a lot of fast-paced growth. I think they may actually have to slow it down and not operate at the same pace that they were doing it before. When you're allowing the metastasization of 50 some odd militias in one country, and they're all kind of going at each other, and maybe you have 7 guys of your own who are micromanaging each thing, there are benefits to that, but then there's also some extreme disadvantages if you're worried about infiltration. So I think, I think they grew a little too fast, a little too quickly. There's a lot of confidence that was there just because of the conditions that were on the ground. But I keep wanting to go back to this question and how to answer it. Like, how do you fix something like that?
There's no easy answer.
No, there isn't. But again, I mean, that's an easy answer I could give you. Well, it's really complicated. But I would say, just from my position, looking at how the militia groups have grown, how the Iranians were running stuff like that, how they were trying to kind of, CYA and also protect themselves. And when I say CYA, that means cover your ass, for those out there who are not aware, like how they were doing that. I do think there is some stuff that you can criticize from it, and if they were serious about it, there would have to be some fixes. But I think on kind of the intelligence side, I mean, I was about to say I'm not an intelligent person, so we'll just leave it at that. But I mean, I'm not one who is working for intelligence. But I think they have already telegraphed, to use an oft used term in media now. They have telegraphed that they wanted to put the hurt on the Israelis. They have telegraphed that they want to put the hurt on the Saudis. They have telegraphed who their enemies are, what they're going to do, and have then executed on it. Not always that successfully, but they just keep doing it, and they don't stop. And I think when you're doing that, given they've always marketed themselves as very long-term players, strategically speaking, it wasn't as beneficial because it just put more onus strategically speaking, on different intelligence agencies to get in there and see what they were doing. Whether it was using, signals intelligence or human intelligence, it was kind of full court press on them.
Iran's attack yesterday consisted of only ballistic missiles, around 180 in total, that breached Israeli airspace. The Guardians will say in Colorado and elsewhere, maybe handled some others. No cruise missiles, no drones, etc., as they launched during the last attack against Israel in April. You always make the point that it's important to pay attention to the kind of weapons Iran and its proxies choose to deploy. In this case, can we discern anything from what weapons they didn't use, unless there's some simple explanation that I'm missing?
Well, it's interesting. There was still simultaneous claims. So, for instance, Al-Muqawama al-Islami fil Iraq, which is the Islamic resistance in Iraq. And just for your listeners, pretty much every group the Iranians run in Iraq that's a Shia militia will call itself the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. Like, they always have that nameplate on the bottom of their seals or their flag or wherever. But for this one, when I say that, I'm talking about a front group that includes anywhere from like 4 to 6 different organizations, established Shia militias that are extraordinarily loyal. Sometimes one of them has had their issues with the Iranians, but they're very, very loyal. But they claimed that there were cruise missile launches that they did from Iraq. Now, they've lied before, but I think it's interesting, if we're talking about what the Iranians directly did, are we counting that as part of it if said attacks did actually happen? I mean, they put up a video and everything else, but the way they marketed it was they wanted, and it's interesting, going back to the PR bit, they wanted that shot that Palestinian Islamic Jihad has used a similar type before, and clearly the graphics were done with some Iranian help. Lebanese Hezbollah has done graphics like this. Some of the Iraqi groups have put graphics where they show Tel Aviv and they show kind of like that main, I think it's like the Diamond Exchange in Ramat Gan. It's a circular kind of building, and then the Ministry of Defense is there and stuff.
Yeah, the Kyria right there by the highway.
So it's this, it's a very distinct building, and they also have distinct buildings that are like on the Tel Aviv and Jaffa, the shoreline that's there. But they'll show that, and they love to show kind of like the rockets smashing into the skyscrapers, and they love to show that stuff. And when we saw the first attack, that happened in April, that actually did involve cruise missiles and drones and a lot of other weapon systems. It's interesting how that was played afterwards. Like, they were looking for the propaganda image. It shouldn't have been surprising to me. But I will say it was actually surprising in terms of how fast it was. Once they got the shot they wanted, boom, did they have stuff produced immediately for that.
Missile trails over the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, look, they did that in April, and then this time around, now it's the kind of glowing orbs that are falling into Tel Aviv shot with a giggling Nasrallah in the background, or like other stuff like that. But it's interesting. There is that PR angle there. I think the other angle on it is, and you can make the argument on one side, when you choose some form of direct action, it's highly likely that the other side will misinterpret it in some way. And it's interesting. There is this line of them, to go back to the telegraphing bit that's always used. They telegraphed, essentially what they would do. That's all well and good. Okay, that's nice. You guys still launched a bunch of ballistic missiles, and I think launching those ballistic missiles and doing that was to send kind of another message of power. Well, who are they trying to send that message of power to? And I said this on Twitter /X, where I was going, a lot of this was more internally focused. They really hit a catch-22, and the catch-22 was either they can continue playing the game of sabr, and we are the sabirin, we are the patient ones, the Quranic patient ones in patience that they emphasize quite a bit, and say this is a patient calculation, and we're just not going to do anything when, like, the key guy, one of our key guys, at probably beyond Soleimani level of importance for our Grand Armée in the Middle East, for our proxy forces, is killed, in addition to a leading IRGC QF commander, in addition to a variety of other people, and we've been mocked consistently, internally and externally, for that lack of response. Or we can kind of bite the bullet here and kind of, just do it. And yeah, there's probably going to be some harsh repercussions, but it's to demonstrate that we're going to continue going. Who does that appeal to? Well, what it said to me, it actually reaffirmed this a bit more, that there was a higher likelihood that they had to do this internally, because if they let Nasrallah if they let the Nasrallah thing go and they didn't have something that was kind of graphically appealing in terms of something they could pull off, and a move they could pull off that looks like, wow, I can't believe they pulled that off. They've been promising this for a while. It is yet another Wadl Sadiq, it's kind of a sacred promise, if you will, in the same form they used to call the Wadl Sadiq, what Nasrallah said. He had the truthful promise, like the sacred promise that he delivered in 2006. It's interesting. They also called the operation that, they called it Wadl Sadiq 2. But I mean, you look at something like that, if they weren't able to kind of produce something like that, I think they would have had, and I think they thought this, far more internal issues from their proxies, seeing and smelling weakness, because the weakness, that blood was already in the water. I'm not saying that these groups were going to just split off and say, we're done with the Iranians, we're done with this, we're done with that. But to maintain some level of cohesiveness and demonstrate that you actually will support not just Nasrallah, but also they lost a leading guy of their own, meaning from IRGC. Had they not done it, then there's nothing they really could do. And no matter what, the repercussions are going to be kind of not so good.
It's funny. I have the tweet of yours from yesterday that you referenced. I have it right here. I was gonna ask a question about it, but you kind of answered it already. But it was, I'll read the tweet if you don't mind. It's not like incriminating or anything. Deterrence is being overused by those following the Israel-Iran issues. Missile attack clearly wasn't about reestablishing it. It was a play to show some strength internally / two proxies in shock, Nasrallah gone. No way Iran wouldn't assume there wouldn't be further repercussions. So my question to you was, and you sort of answered it, that I saw this yesterday. I was like, oh, he's kind of saying this is more for like, the messaging was more for like internal consumption, like Iranians saying, don't worry, daddy's still here with the big guns.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that their move, and after I kind of let it kind of sit for a little while, and I was really trying to think about this, how did they cover it? I've been doing these little threads on there where I will go through kind of my wide list of, each group. Sometimes I'll have like 40 different accounts for them, and then I kind of write down what they're saying in them and just look at them. And I do it for myself, but I'm figuring like who's going to actually read that. So now I've just kind of stuck kind of synopses of it on Twitter.
Me on my couch with my cat sitting in the dark reading this, like, yeah.
Well, it's better than me. I'm actually writing it when I have a small parrot on my finger that's trying to eat my computer. Luckily, the cat isn't there. But it's I would say it's interesting to watch how they reacted to it, and I'm not saying that all of those reactions were 100% honest. Like you're seeing public reactions that they're putting out, but the public reactions were almost so in line with one another. There was definitely a structure to it. There was definitely a messaging angle that was required to kind of come out. And it just felt to me that was more of an emphasis. And again, I don't want a misconception to be born from this where I am saying, well, it's like they're kind of angry with Mama Bear not doing enough for them. Well, that can happen. And I don't want people to think that magically means an organization will just split from the Iranian orbit. A lot of these groups require Iranian funding. They require Iranian support. They require the arms to come from them. They require the political overhead because they are often not the only group in the country. They're often sometimes set against another group that's also backed by the Iranians. This is another mode of control that Iran uses. But that doesn't mean that you will not get some reactions. And I mean, you don't want like 5 groups getting together and saying, yeah, isn't that messed up that no one really cared that we lost like 5 commanders and they didn't care that their best guys that we look up to got waxed earlier. I think that is something, if you're kind of doing proxy management, that you kind of have to take account for, and you kind of have to do it. But I also think, again, let's say they didn't do anything. Let's say there was no response. That's just more of the same then, that they've already been mocked for constantly.
At a time and place of our choosing.
Yes. So, I mean, that's essentially what it comes down to. So, I mean, imagine it's the catch-22 that I'm getting at. What are you going to do? And the Israelis very successfully and very strategically, they're very intelligent with the strategy of calling the bluff. Well, okay, let's keep doing this, and let's keep doing this, and let's keep doing this. It was so overwhelming that, again, there was no other real choice they could have made, and yet it was still the wrong choice because there's now going to be another response from the Israelis. That'll probably cost them something.
We've talked a lot about deterrence here. It's interesting that Iran's attack on Israel yesterday was reestablishing deterrence for Israel's strike on Nasrallah and Hania mostly, which was done by Israel to reestablish deterrence for October 7th. And it's just cycle that sort of goes all the way back, right? So I got thinking yesterday about that whole kind of issue. And I was thinking back to our conversation at the end of the last show about sort of like reflecting back on the last year since October 7th. And I don't know, I have this kind of like soup in my head that I wanted to sort of like suss out for you and kind of see what you think here. You probably won't agree, but I don't know that I entirely agree with what I'm about to say here. It's more just like a thought that I have in my head that I don't quite know what to do with, but bear with me here. It's often said that Israel's purpose in this war, aside from eliminating those responsible for October 7th, is to reestablish deterrence. But one question I haven't seen discussed is, if the objective is to reestablish deterrence, shouldn't it first be pinpointed when and how it was lost? Clearly, it wasn't in place on October 5th or October 6th, or at any point during the 2 years Hamas spent planning and training for the attack. It would seem to me that deterrence was lost whenever Hamas first seriously calculated they could pull this off. At the same time, Israeli intelligence intercepted the whole playbook for October 7th over a year in advance and dismissed it. The IDF then redeployed units near Gaza to the West Bank, arguably for domestic political purposes. I've always thought, did Hamas actually outwit and outgun Israel's security establishment on October 7th? And I think not really. They weren't defeated. They neglected to show up that morning. They forfeited the game. And I'm not equivocating the two, but it's like both belligerents here, Bibi's cabinet and the pungent stew of Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and maybe hitched onto that wagon, you can include the Iraqi groups and the Houthis and all of that, got way too high on their own supply. And the result was the worst mass slaughter of Jews since 1945, followed by this horrific regional war that's killed 40,000 Gazans and could yet spin out of control even further. It's like your point that Hezbollah and the Iranians forgot that the Israelis had a vote here also. I think if you go back to October 5th and 6th, both sides forgot that the other also had a vote here. Now, any country with the means to do so would unleash hell on anyone who did that to their people on October 7th. And the threat from Hezbollah against northern Israel has been strategically untenable for years. If a Russian-backed Canadian militia had a massive arsenal aimed at Buffalo or Seattle, we'd never tolerate it. Israel's intelligence community has since pulled off some truly historic feats to restore their honor at home and remind the world of their reputation. So is this a matter of Israel needing to reestablish deterrence, or is it more straightforward? Do they need to just demonstrate their capabilities, dispense justice for October 7th, and not forfeit the game again? I'm not sure I have an answer, thus I ask you.
I do not think you are wrong in the least to say deterrence, quote unquote, was technically lost by the Israelis prior to October 7th. I think the fact that, their intelligence apparatus was working pretty well, but, policy and kind of how they were understanding the intelligence they were getting, that was an issue. The other thing is, I think there's a great line from 9/11, which was, we had a failure of imagination. And I think a lot of different entities in the Middle East, this includes the Iranians were setting Hamas up for, hang glider style attacks. They were setting them up for, successful tunneling operations. They were setting them up for, more advanced arms and more advanced equipment, and how they were kind of developed as military actors within Gaza. There's no really way you could deny that. But this kind of comes down to what I had said a number of times on here. You had groups that were met with different levels of catastrophic success. The Iranians, I'm pretty sure, knew that an operation was coming. Pretty sure the Israelis thought it. I'm pretty sure sometimes overconfidence is a definite direct effect. I also think when you take a policy position like the Israelis did, which is kind of downgrading Hamas, hey, we have them contained, quite literally contained in Gaza. Yeah, there's some guys that are kind of developing their ways in the West Bank. We can deal with that. And, the PA will have to deal with that as well. But I think that kind of that general attitude, that cost them quite dearly. The other thing was kind of you said this, and I hope I'm not misreading it. This really comes down to the Iranian position on a lot of this. Well, why would they get involved? Well, it's just like this, sink that's kind of constantly sucking the water out, and they just kind of got sucked into this. I think in part because of a lot of the.
Oh, I think they're self-aware actors in this. They're not the dog being wagged by the tail.
Yeah, I don't buy. I don't buy that at all either. I think that they knew what was going to happen, and I also think they were struck by how successful it really was. I think that their thinking on it was probably, well, the Israelis they have a pretty effective military and a pretty effective cordon on Gaza, and there might be a few things out, there might be some hostages taken, but it'll be like, Gilad Shalit level, but a little bit larger. And Hamas and Sinwar took this like it was, wow, this is, a kid in the candy store. What can I try and pull off, and how can I do it? And they were also, by chance, because of kind of luck of the draw on it, they were met with that success, meaning it was a lot of stuff was undefended, a lot of things did not really come up the way many assumed that they would. So, but to go back to this, in terms of deterrence, I think part of it is, for the Israelis anyway, dealing with the deterrence picture. And when it comes to the deterrence picture, it's if you launch an operation of that magnitude again, look at what we can do. Look at what we can bring to the table. Do you really want to play that game? Do you want your proxy army to be rolled back like nobody's business, and done so when at a time and place of our choosing, which is essentially what they've done? It's like there's a level of I think, mockery of the Iranians that's there. It's also, how much patience do you think the Israelis? I could make the argument that the Israelis exhibited a good level of patience when it came to kind of the annoyances that they were facing from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, from the missile attacks from the Houthis, from other issues with the Iraqis. And I think because of that, it sent the wrong message to the Iranians, and also sent the wrong message to the Americans too. The Americans, who constantly have been complaining about the potential for escalation and a regional war, which is priceless because when you have a multitude of groups from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, in addition to Gaza, in addition to Palestinian groups in Lebanon, in addition to attacks that are going on within West Bank and Israel proper, I think that kind of defines as a regional war, But regardless, I mean, I think that there is this kind of this mindset where, okay, well, they can have their little dust up and squabble. It'll last a couple of weeks. And, we just have to kind of maintain this constance that'll be okay. And maybe things will wrap up in Gaza. And I think the Israelis were looking at this going, wait a second, hold on, back up. There are still people who were kidnapped that are theirs. There is still the damage that was done to this is like 1973, talking about the Yom Kippur War, levels of surprise and kind of attrition that they're facing, and losses,
trauma and shock.
Yes,
and
all of it. I don't think a lot of that's been calculated. I think a lot of people, and I think this qualifies for both ends. They're not really factoring in, just the trauma that's actually happened. I don't like to use the the psychological speak babble, but I do actually I do think that there's a genuine piece to that is not being picked up on, and you can feel it's. Speaking of things that are quite palpable, again, I've tried to talk to lots of different people. I'm talking to Lebanese on one end, and I'll talk to a bunch of Israelis that I know on another end, and talk to Iraqis that I know on another. But with the Israelis, I mean, I can tell you just from those first couple months after this, people did not sound the same. There was like a good level of PTSD. Now imagine factor that in for a policymaker who was kind of high on their horse and, hey, we have such an advanced army. Hey, we have such advanced intelligence, put that down. I mean, imagine the level of hit that takes when your country is the vaunted representative of being the intelligence leader when it comes to dealing with issues threatening the country.
You and I were both kids, but we remember 9/11 and what it was like here after that.
For us, we were kind of fresh and new in terms of looking at a lot of that. But I would say that hasn't left me. I mean, I was living in the New York metro area, and my school alone, we lost like 5 or 6 parents for 9/11. I still remember the first year where there were kids. We had a little ceremony in the school, and kids were weeping. They were just weeping in the hallways. It was just unbelievable. You could never seen something like that. But now imagine this, where you're having entire villages that have been wiped out by Hamas with videos of it. and a lot of other really, really horrific acts. And again, this isn't to downplay everything else that's going on in the war, particularly the stuff that's going on in Gaza too. But there is, I just feel like that unaddressed piece to this. The Israelis may be looking for some form of redress. It's the, how do you get this back? How do you get that position? It's kind of like the beeper attacks. Were they tactically sound and effective? For the most part, yeah. Were they an intelligence masterpiece? Yes. Were they really unique and outside the box? Totally. Or is this something that people are going to be talking about for years afterwards? You bet your ass they are. It's a bit like Al-Muhandis, and I'm not talking about Abu Mahdi Al-Muhandis. I'm talking about Yahya Ayash, the engineer, who
Oh, right.
interestingly, he also had a phone issue because he used a cell phone. I forgot it was PETN or something, or Semtex or something that was in the phone the Israelis put in. But I remember he was calling his father and they blew it up and it blew his head off. Well, if you recall the things that he did beforehand, we're talking about bus bombings, suicide bus bombings, and he was building the vests for them. But he was doing that. We're talking about multiple suicide bus bombings that were really brutal in terms of the numbers that they had taken. Speaking of trauma that happened with that group, well, here they infiltrated his network. They even got into his phone, and they got him as he was calling apparently his father. At least that's according to the stories that are told about it. That's something that people were talking about right after 9/11. Like, that was an example of, well, look, and this is how you can handle Islamist terrorism and da 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 da. But I mean, I think you look at something like this, it's kind of, how do you regain that presence? And again, I can't really put my finger on what it truly addresses, but it does address something. It's a je ne sais quoi that's there that covers a lot of different little micro kind of subject matters. The other pieces to this, in terms of that deterrence, quote unquote, I don't know, and I don't know if the Israelis even think about this anymore. I think that they've come around to a position of, deterrence only means so much. But I do think it's the mess with us, and we're going to bring the hurt, and we'll bring the hurt in ways that you could never imagine. Now, does that qualify as kind of the academic textbook version of deterrence? Well, in some ways it does. Does it classify in, I guess, the policymaker sense, or does it work as long-term as some might think? Might it have some blowback to it? Because, hey, if I'm a group and you're telling me I can't do something and my whole thing is doing it, it's just how some work.
Right.
Again, remains to be seen. But what I would say is, I mean, you kind of look at this in terms of what it's actually degrading in terms of capabilities. I think that's another piece of this deterrence puzzle. They have decapitated Lebanese Hezbollah in such a way that they have removed the head, they have removed chunks of the neck, and they have removed chunks of the arms, fingers, and legs and feet. And it's just, I mean, you look at it and it's been happening over what, almost 3 week period. And again, there's little spurts here and there, from the summer. But this is where kind of the big stuff is hitting. And it's not just Lebanese Hezbollah. It's anyone who's touched the Iranians. It's like the Houthi commander in a helicopter who crashed with a bunch of IRGC in it in Iran. It's a bit like the 3 PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Some may remember that from their time hijacking aircraft in the 1970s. That was actually the group that caused the so-called Black September in Jordan. 1970 Dawson's Field, they hijacked 3 or 4 different aircraft and landed them there. But I mean, that's a Marxist terrorist organization, but it had gone over to being an Iranian proxy. And the guys who are spearheading, the group that meets with Lebanese Hezbollah and meets with Iran, and by extension, through Hezbollah meets with Iran, they are all killed in a hotel room in Beirut in one shot. This is also after you have a command structure that belongs to Al-Jama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic group, which is the Muslim Brotherhood section that's in Lebanon, that has now, even though there's splits within it, become markedly more pro-Hezbollah, and they've been re-outfitted by Hezbollah. They've been launching rockets into Israel, and they're also extraordinarily close to Hamas. Let's not forget that Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood group. But, they had a number of leadership that was in it that were also removed. These were guys who were with their Quwat al-Fajr, their Fajr forces, as they're called. And this all happened within a 48-hour period. We're talking about a multitude of groups, all with links going to Lebanese Hezbollah. And I always love using the old 9X ad from New York City. It's like 9X New York Telephone. So it used to go, "We're all connected New York Telephone." And it was like everyone who's now connected in with that, we're all connected, Lebanese, Hezbollah, and Iran. And anybody who had that link is now getting just kind of wiped from the picture. And it's all happening in such rapid succession. That does not bode well for, organizational capabilities. I'm not saying it can't be rebuilt, but the rebuilding process, it's not even going to be like a 3 or 4 year thing. We're talking decades of rebuilding. Now, does that count as deterrence? Does that count as, I guess, putting your enemy in another position so you can, better kind of better protect your forces and better protect your population? I think the argument can be made, yes, that certainly does that. That certainly assists with the process so that Iran can't reach out and touch you again. So yeah, I mean, I think that calculus is there as well.
It's a tough thing to juggle with. I just noticed, like, when we were talking, and especially last night when you mentioned when you use that D word, deterrence, in terms of the Iranian attack yesterday, it was just this weird thing that kind of clicked to me. Like, this is all just this tit for tat spiral about reestablishing deterrence. And I thought, like, where was it lost in the beginning? Where was the original sin of this? And I don't know. It's just an interesting
we
thought
could trace
experiment that I had.
I think if we're talking about original sin,
Well, you could go back to 79.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, you could even go back to 82. You could go back to 2006. I'm certain there were some people around that would say it goes all the way back to 1947. There were some that would say it goes back to 1917. There are others that would say it goes back to 1923. It's like, we can do this until we're blue in the face. I think in the recent setting, I know this is a criticism that I would have of some of this thinking, and I'm not saying there isn't a truth to kind of the deterrence argument, but it's kind of this annoying pseudo-intellectual way of viewing things. And it comes from a lot of academia. It comes from a lot of talking heads who, are working from a conclusion backwards in search of supportive facts. I'm not going to name names. It's kind of like subtweeting, but I think people can figure it out when they're looking around. It sounds really fluffy and serious, and it sounds like a really good IR textbook. And to re-achieve deterrence, and I can coldly analyze it this way, and da-da-da-da-da. I don't really know if it often falls into that positioning. I think there's a lot of emotionalism here. Obviously, there would be. It's a war. I think that's not being accounted for. I think that, Iran's goals, is it deterrence per se? Well, they've clearly demonstrated they are an ideologically motivated country, even if said ideology isn't all that popular, even at home. I hate the reductio ad Hitlerum stuff, but I actually do think there's a strong parallel here. It's interesting. You look at kind of how the Germans were prosecuting the last days of World War II. They were still killing Jews, and they were still executing people who were traitors. When they say traitors, I mean people who were trying to surrender to the Allies. That was still going on until the last days. It was
like muscle memory.
Yeah, but you look at that, and it's this commitment to the cause, even though, well, the Russian tanks are literally in Berlin underneath the Reichstag. What now?
We're sending wave of 12-year-olds out in front of these battle-hardened Soviet shock troops.
And it's funny you say that, because during the Iran-Iraq War, which really got started in this time period, in 1980, what you had was a bunch of kids who were the Iranians put a bunch of plastic keys on them in some cases and had them run over mines when they didn't have enough minesweeper equipment. And I'm talking, and we talk about ideological motivation and people not taking it seriously. And I think this is a big split in a lot of Western academia and policy circles. It's I paraphrase this, and I still know the person who said it to me, and I still criticize them for what they said to me. But it's this kind of materialist argument for everything, which is, it's almost like Tom Friedman in Lexus and the Olive Tree saying that there's going to be peace between the Syrians and Israelis because the Syrians were watching cornflake commercials from Israel, and the cornflakes looked crisper. He put that in his book. That's actually in his book. Yes, and that's a motivator for peace. No, but okay. And again, Syria isn't the same kind of ideological level of thinking as, say, the Iranians are, or at least the Islamic
Republic. It's like a poor man's McDonald's theory.
It's a bit like that, but I think there's this misunderstanding. It's kind of like, well, the IRGC commanders, they have these big parties with liquor, and sometimes there's drugs, and their kids are taking pictures in their mansions in Tabriz and putting it up on Instagram. okay, so because they have a white Mercedes or a white BMW and they cruise around with a gold chain, you're telling me that that's somehow going to motivate them to not continue attacking the groups that they've been attacking for a while. Yes,
And
clearly
to
there's some
embrace
hypocrisy.
classical secular liberal democracy.
Yes, but see, this is how it translates out, though. See, they're just like us, so why would they want that? It's like, like Kantian
Yeah.
peace theory. Well, if you have a bunch of democracies and they all want to trade with one another, why would they attack one another? Well, there's a lot of disputes. Not all of them are completely rational, and sometimes they just keep going and going, even when people have lost the rationale for some of them. But I do think there's this misconception there, and I do actually, believe this, that in the Islamic Republic, in terms of their leadership apparatus, you do have a lot of genuine, true believers. This is my issue with Nasrallah. He was a genuine, true believer, despite the fact that there was plenty of corruption and hypocrisy that happened with Lebanese Hezbollah, and he still carried that out. It was something that he projected quite effectively. You can say two things that might sound opposing, but they can both be true. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that when it comes to really looking at this situation and kind of looking at what, say, Iran wants. So is it deterrence per se? I don't know if that would even be the right definition. I don't really know. Think if everyone's trying to just do things out of a specific academic theory and kind of form it in this paradigm style of thinking, it doesn't allow for a lot of other things to be included in there. And this goes particularly for Iran, its proxies. I don't think that there is any logic to how they're doing their things, but their logic is not necessarily what yours is, and it might not ever be. Try to think like them and have some empathy for what they're doing, and then move forward with it. But I don't think that often happens. And I think often there's a miss or overread on something, and then there's no real confirmation going off of any other angle on it. I know I sound completely arrogant sounding like this. I know it, and I don't want to, but it's something just when you watch it long enough, it's kind of one of those things like, okay, here we go again. It's the same line that I heard 10 years ago. It's the same line that I heard 5 years ago. It's like nobody read the literature afterwards. It's like nobody learned the lesson. And I think there's a lot of that going on. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about Iraq war fatigue. I would actually say that institutional memory after we quote unquote lose a war, I put that in quotes, it's interesting how quickly it drains and what people revert to as examples to kind of move forward when a new crisis happens. Everything that's old is new again.
That's like I mentioned in the last episode when this came up, and I said, yeah, we're weary from Iraq until a carrier goes down in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, and then all history was just erased. Yeah, it's that same kind of. I mean, we talked about this. I love exploring this in the novels, just where we go as a society when we're confronted with these kind of events, and I think you can absolutely see that in what's happened in the last year since October 7th.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big part of what things are happening now. And it's, here's another little bit to go off of. And I tend to disagree with, disagree with a lot of people, including people who even agree with me. There's been it's ideologically informed, but I don't think it's incorrect. This attitude of, and the new Middle East is coming. And I'm noticing it quite a bit from places that I didn't expect it from, where it's Lebanese Hezbollah can finally be knocked out, and there's going to be a functional Lebanese government, and then the axis of resistance is going to be rolled back, and who knows, maybe there won't even be, the Iranian mullahs, they won't be around leading Iran. They use terminology like this, and whether they're on the left or on the right or in the center or wherever. But it's really, it's fascinating to me because it doesn't take a lot of history into account at all. It doesn't take even recent history. And, I will say it was actually nice to have this conversation, and I don't mean to malign the person that I was talking to. I was on that Twitter space thing. And one of them said to me, you have a lot of pessimism about, Lebanese government and what they can bring to the table when it comes to Hezbollah. And, part of my thinking was, well, I have it's not pessimism, it's just basic realism because I lived there. I even talked to the people that were being referenced as, well, look, and so-and-so is saying this for how to disarm Hezbollah. These are all the same lines that we heard from 2005 until 2010. Sometimes it just stopped in 2008 after Hezbollah really, schwacked a lot of their political opposition after they invaded Beirut. But, it's interesting how quickly that's forgotten, and people will hear a statement and then really read into that statement and not look for the broader context, the broader swath of of what was really going on and kind of how much viability that has. And I've seen like two ends of this, where one end is, and finally the Lebanese army will be able to do X, Y, and Z. Really? What do you know about the Lebanese army and their capabilities of doing so? There are sections of the Lebanese army, if we can recall back to, and not everything is a parallel to the Lebanese civil war, but it's a good parallel right now. There are sections of the Lebanese army that are a little bit more pro-Hezbollah. There are also sections that are a little bit more neutral on things. There are also sections that may be gung-ho about it privately, but it's not like they're going to go to the Janub and take care of it. And I think they're just as afraid of getting blown up by an EFP that Lebanese Hezbollah has laid there, and also the populations in certain villages that support them. And that doesn't really sound like a viable quest for them. So that's out of the way on that side. Then the other side is it's this misconception that the rival political parties of Lebanese Hezbollah are going to materialize their own force. Well, I hate to break this to people, but, on the Sunni and Druze side, the Druze, who, by the way, generally we're talking about Walid Jumblat before, it's not like Walid Jumblat and the PSP for his small militia apparatus that's there. Like they're just going to roll out of the mountains and start solving problems in the Janub. That's not how that works. Same thing goes with the Lebanese forces under Sami al-Jaja, who would probably be the most capable of any, remaining kind of quasi-armed force. Well, they haven't really been an armed force since the early 90s. Oddly, the same time around Abbas al-Musawi meeting his end, because they turned in the vast majority of their weapons. They don't have the same capabilities as before. A lot of their guys are old. It's not like they're training up in the mountains constantly, and they've got this whole stream of 18-year-olds that are gung-ho. Okay, are we expecting them to wipe out Hezbollah and Dahia when the Israelis invaded in 1982 and they were unable to even do minor operations in West Beirut, and just expected the Israelis to do it? Like it's just, I don't know. There's just this sense of unreality and kind of wishful thinking that's not based on really just unfortunate constants that are just there. That's not cynicism. It's just kind of being realistic about it. And I think this kind of attitude of, hey, we're, finally we've reached the future and we have our flying cars now, that's not there. It's just not there. And, I get worried sometimes when there are a lot of like serious people who, and again, I don't expect them to know every little microcosmic thing about Lebanon or even about Hezbollah or anything else, but it's these notions that pop up and then they try to enforce said notions, but there was no means to do it to begin with. Like, it's just,
right.
I don't know, it's
I must
mind-boggling.
Make this theory true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's working from a conclusion in search of supportive facts. But I think we've even bypassed the supportive facts. It's but they're saying a nice thing. Okay. Great.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping for a nice sort of tidy bow would present itself to tie off this episode, but it did not present itself. I don't know. And my neighbor's now going with the leaf blower, which is sort of, I don't know if you can hear that, but it's sort of like the orchestra in the pit at the Academy Awards. This has been another supersized conversation here. This might be, I have to check, this might be like a record for length for this podcast.
I apologize in advance.
No. This is fine. It's been a tectonic few days in the region for these groups that we've been talking about, these actors that we've been talking about for the last year. And I have no doubt the next few could be just as tectonic. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's best that we can do, but I guess advice going forward. And I'm sorry, again, I tend to get very excited during these things as we're really getting into it. So
don't apologize.
Well, I'm just hoping that I'm not being so tangential and kind of excitedly going through it that it's like a blur. But what I would say is there's a lot of wisdom in kind of if one is watching this stuff, taking kind of a pause and then assessing a lot of the other moving pieces going forward. And when I say that, you brought up the issue of weapons with what did the Iranians use, and you have to kind of look at it from that perspective and, what message are they trying to send? I would say if a lot of the kind of big picture stuff is annoying, if you focus on those little bits, it's fascinating how much of the big picture it actually helps fill in. And if it doesn't fill something in, I would say it actually does assist in getting another little piece, and then eventually you can fill in that big piece. But I try to give that advice to other analysts who look at this who are kind of like, I'm flustered. But I would highly recommend that for people. Like if all of this is like a stream of kind of Gatling gun fire, coming out of an A-10, then I would say kind of pick one of those things, focus on it, and I can promise you, you're going to get something out of it. You're going to get something out of it, and kind of the more you focus on it, the things that you get out of it might be so very unique that you see a totally different trend, but it doesn't mean that it negates what the actual big picture is that a lot of other people might be saying.
You know what? That was the neat bow that I was looking for to wrap this up. Thank you for that.
I try.
Yeah, I'm quite skilled. All right, sir, Phillip Smyth, we will, as always, have all of your details in the show notes. If folks want to follow you on Twitter, read your work, all that stuff, great follow, great mind and voice to follow and pay attention to. I'm saying follow a lot as developments come in this part of the world. As always, my friend, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks again for having me. And again, I'm sorry that these issues just keep coming down the board, and I'm even more sorry that you have to deal with me.
Hey, you know what? It's a small price to pay.
Well, actually, you know what? I'm sorry that your audience has to deal with me. No, you deserve this.
All right. I'll talk to you probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, well, that'd be good. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.